Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135. And to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them, and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which formed part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the 8th of the 9, and is a conversation between Ben Castell, Wray, Vicky Payne and Hana Loftus about design and placemaking. Ben is a town planning director at AECOM, Katie is a planning director at Deloitte, Vicky is director of planning and urban design at Bhalla Works, and Hana is a director at Hat Projects. Their conversation takes in beauty, design codes, the Office for Place, new towns, and mansard roofs. Enjoy!
We've come together to reflect on how the new government are doing with regard to design and placemaking. Some of us had a similar conversation, I think it was last July, when the government was new, and that was before the NPPF came out and before really they'd done anything. Now this is clearly a good time to reflect. What we want to do is look at 3 kind of overarching questions. The first of which is what's changed? So what have they done? The second is what might they do, or what do we think they're going to do? And then we'll just finish at the end by looking at things that we wanted to have changed but haven't really changed, or things that might be coming up in the future. So I'll kick us off on the first of those things. And I think as I mentioned, we need to start with the NPPF, which was probably the first thing that happened, the draft NPPF at least, was the first thing that happened under the new government in this arena. And I think there were 3 key things, or maybe 2 key things that happened in that for design. The first of which was a real toning down of beauty. And I think about half, or maybe exactly half of the references to beauty were deleted, including in a chapter title, which used to have beautiful places in it, which doesn't anymore. So we've gone back to well designed, which is something which the profession was always keen on, was always pushing on. So we'll come back and hear reflections on that in a second. The second, I think, was a downplaying of the role of district-wide design codes. So the previous draft NPPF had those as the key tool for securing high design quality, and now it's been downgraded to one of the tools, which again I think probably reflects what the industry was thinking. And then the third may sound a bit trivial, but the third one for me was the very odd emphasis that the NPPF under Gove had on mansard roofs has totally been put back into its box, if you like. They're still referenced, but referenced only as one of the ways which you might grow a building upwards. It's all very odd. So I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about some of those things. Maybe starting off with the old beauty versus design quality chestnut.
Yes, I mean, I think you're right to say that the profession breathed a bit of a sigh of relief at that one. On money levels, it is, of course, as we know, it's semantics, isn't it? Neither of them are exactly objective terminology either. But I think it is always felt that well designed is a little bit easier to judge with a little bit more objectivity, because it includes questions around functionality and how a place actually works, as well as what it looks like. And as we all know, the best designed places are those where the functionality and the way that it looks and feels goes hand in hand. So we do need to have that. I think it is a little bit of a semantics on some levels, because we've also seen that the government have been very public in going to places like Nanseland for visits, and maybe from a kind of aesthetic perspective, they're not necessarily moving so far from the previous agenda, but the language is different, which is helpful, isn't it?
Mm. I think as well, one of the key changes that I was pleased to see retained, so there's obviously this taking out of all of the language around, not all of, but a lot of the language around beauty. But Matthew Carmona of UCL has talked about this change between development that is not well designed should be refused, which was in the 2021 version. And then permission should be refused for development of poor design, which was in the that was in the 2012 version. And I think that it changed the emphasis around design in quite a helpful way, at least by his kind of analysis of decision making. And that change has been retained in the most up-to-date version, which I think is a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think for me, it's very much reflective of kind of the Labour's commitment to sort of to devolution and local decision making as well, because beauty always felt like quite a top-down approach, and obviously, very strongly associated with the Office for Place, which we can come on to. But well designed, as you've said, Hannah, just seems a lot more objective and a lot more rooted in place, and what's best for a local community.
I think it was the redevelopment of the television centre on the South Bank, where where it was very clearly articulated in the inquiry that even though Nicholas Boyce Smith was giving evidence to the contrary, that you can't measure beauty, that it is a subjective term, but you can define what good design is or what high quality places are, because they're defined in things like the National Design Guide and the NPPF to some extent. And yes, I think really it's just the kind of formalizing the kind of things that we were all hoping and expecting. It's probably not what probably isn't so clear cut is design codes and the usefulness or not of a district-wide design code. Of course, they'll still exist. And there are lots in place now, but they don't have to exist, I think, is the key point here. So reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a sensible reconfiguration of the role of design codes in the kind of mix of different tools that you can use to set design standards. I think some commentators in the industry were sort of more along the lines, when the changes came out, they were like, oh, that's it for design coding, like design coding's off the agenda. And I kind of very much hope that that isn't the case, because I think for some local authorities and in some contexts, it can be a really, really useful tool, even at the district-wide level. I spoke at an event in Trafford a while back, and they were talking about how useful their kind of local authority design code had been in terms of being able to refuse poorer quality development. And I lived on the border of Trafford for a while, and I've seen some of not to speculate on any specific schemes, but I've seen the quality of some of the development that came forward. And I think it is a really useful thing for some local authorities to be able to have these codes in place.
I know that. I think Hannah, I know you've produced at least one district-wide design code.
Yeah.
I know Katie has been working with applicants on the other side of the table. So, Hannah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Vicky, you're totally right that in certain circumstances they are really, really helpful, particularly where an authority has a lack of resources, which we know is a problem often, in terms of specialist design officers in-house. Having something a bit more solid that your regular planning officer can refer to can really help. I do also think that, and I think we've seen this, that authorities who haven't already been starting to put one in place have definitely paused on that. They've read the music there and gone, this isn't something we have to have. And I hope we reach a little bit of a middle ground, because some of the design codes that were coming out, if I'm honest, I thought were very cumbersome. I thought they were very, very lengthy and difficult to use for officers and for applicants. You don't need the Bible on design. You'd literally, 500, 900 pages. I'd love to see targeted design codes. I think that the approach that really works is when it's quite targeted, specific area, specific type of development, specific problem maybe that you might have that is in your area, because of the topography that you have, or because of the way that your urban area is built up over time, whatever it might be. And then the site-wide design codes for the strategic and the major sites, which I think we all know are an incredibly useful and well-tested tool to control major sites. But I don't think anyone will be sort of sad to see the back of a very lengthy biblical length design code for a local authority area, just because they felt they had to cover every base.
Yeah, and we're sort of jumping into a little bit of your looking ahead part, Ben, but I think we know that the government is looking at the National Model Design Code, and my hope is that as part of that, they will develop a bit more guidance about how to use it and how to use it proportionately, because when we developed it, there was supposed to be a kind of sliding scale of what you include. If you're coding at a district-wide level and you're coding for a whole area, you really shouldn't be going down into the depths of all of the design detail. There should be a kind of proportionate scale at which you hit different themes. And then as you get down to the kind of site allocation or down to specific sites, you can go into more detail and add other layers of coding. But as you say, Hannah, there have been these quite monstrous, like large documents created with a lot of very detailed guidance for a very broad geographic area, which is very tricky.
Yeah, and kind of reflecting on the applicant side, as it were, I think I could definitely see it definitely felt like another barrier in place, and kind of in some cases, local authorities just wanting to maintain control as long as possible and not necessarily the most efficient use of their time. But I think absolutely where it's a sort of major regeneration area or an area with sort of multiple landowners, I think they work very well coming hand in hand with sort of setting development parameters as well. So particularly around density and which obviously then impacts land values, but just setting the expectations at a level that the public and private sector agree on. So they're all sort of going into a process with the same sort of expectations to what's going to come out of that site. So, the best examples I've seen are where it almost, it's almost setting a vision for an area and almost sort of semi-acting like a sort of outline planning permission in a way. So everybody goes into it, with the agreed expectations, and it really in that respect it does really de-risk something for an applicant. So I think a great value in that respect. But I wasn't a big fan of the district wide approach for every place.
Okay, so I think we can say that the NPPF design changes, broadly speaking, have been positive, and the kind of things the people in the profession wanted to see. I think, however, they were probably bad news for those people who were pushing district-wide design codes, pushing beauty and pushing mansard roofs, which meant that probably on the 30th of July last year was the kind of the writing was on the wall for the Office for Place at that point. So I think there's a clear link between the kind of the profession taking back control, if you like, and the Office for Place being eventually and subsequently abolished because they were so closely identified with a particular agenda. I think that was probably the key shortcoming of them. So I'll be happy to hear what you guys think about that.
I think it's a shame, really. Like I completely understand and could see that link with a very particular agenda and with the beauty agenda. But the positive thing about that period, along with all of the kind of slightly I don't know how to describe the conversations around beauty, let's say unhelpful conversations around beauty, there was nevertheless a much more present discourse around design and design quality that I think was helpful. And actually the national policy outputs that have been generated from at times quite an unhelpful conversation have in themselves been quite helpful. And I would really like to see an ongoing organization, whether it's within MHCLG or externally, maintaining that focus on raising design quality standards in the UK, and in particular tackling design inequality in the UK, because there is a real disconnect between what more affluent places get in terms of design quality and what places are, with lower incomes and lower values get. And I think it's a real shame.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the Office for Place. I could see it working well, but equally, again, going back to that sort of centralized control and not being local place based enough. But I think Vicky, you're right. There is this inequality and a gap, which you particularly see with local design panel reviews. When there was more structure around these sort of more associated with CABE, for example, it felt like you were getting more even, holistic sort of commentary. And now I think, it's very mixed in terms of the responses you get. And as a result, I think they've got a lot less credence. So because, the advice is not necessarily always the most reliable or have the highest quality, I think then local authorities and applicants have said, well, you can't, it doesn't really matter what they say. We've got our own experts. So I think there is something there to be done in terms of raising that consistent bar for local design review panels.
I think the conclusion we came to last summer was there is a role for an organisation like the Office for Place, but it might not be necessarily the way the Office for Place was set up at that time. I mean, for me, what's happened is we've had a period of 4 or 5 years where quite a small number of think tanks have had a lot of influence over government design policy and planning policy as a whole. Policy Exchange and Create Streets are the two obvious ones. And some of that was helpful, and but some of it was either kind of disastrous, which was like the planning white paper that came out, which the government of the time had to disown, and things like street votes, which were a massive distraction because it got front pages in the tabloids and the broadsheets. It gave the impression that something was being done to solve the housing crisis, but actually it wasn't. It was never going to happen, and so I see that influence of the small number of think tanks that probably came from centre right or did come from centre right perspective, not in favour anymore. But instead, we've got the civil servants coming to the fore again. And it's interesting you mentioned CABE, Katie. I note that now the chief planner, the head of architecture, and the newly created head of placemaking at MHCLG are all people who had senior positions at CABE, and so that's I think the prism in which to see that, and they're people who understand, essentially, they understand how development happens and how good design can happen, and so I think they're steeped in it throughout their professional lives, and so I'm very happy that this has happened. Should we quickly talk about the New Towns Task Force as well as the other thing, which has probably happened in the last 9 months or so? We've seen an interim report that came out from them in February.
Yeah.
Who wants to talk about that?
The interim report kind of said a lot, didn't say very much at all, really. So it kind of said the right things. I think the thing I was most piqued my interest is probably the point around higher density. I work a lot of major sort of city developments, so that's a conversation we're having a lot. And what I'd be interested in is how committed they are, because I always find that once everyone's got over the principle of the development, density is the next biggest sticking point, because, density doesn't mean a big sprawling development or doesn't mean a big tall tower, both of which have got advantages and disadvantages. So, Vicky, I know you were very involved in some of the task group meetings. So I'd be interested to get your viewpoint on the density.
I don't want to overstate my level of involvement, but I was an attendee at 2 of the roundtables that they had. So one was on design and one was on master planning. And density was definitely spoken about at those, and like design more generally. And I think from what I could gather, where they're thinking in terms of the degree to which they're going to comment on design as part of the work, is that they seem very interested in design and design standards, but more in the context of the kind of structural things that help to deliver design quality. So we talked a lot about delivery mechanisms, which I think are very important. The kind of the site selection process and site location is really important. Setting some standards. So I was quite keen to emphasize the usefulness of setting some high level design standards in like policy terms or whatever framework is being used. And then having a long-term interest in the site. So whether that's a master developer model or a landowner that is going to stay in the area and have a long-term interest and sort of reputational interest in how the site comes forward. So my understanding is that they're kind of thinking along those lines. On the density point, it was really interesting because there were representatives from like major house builders and major developers there. And we had quite a frank and realistic conversation about what customers actually want in terms of house types, particularly in some of these like locations that are outside urban centres. You move out to those locations not necessarily because you want to live in an apartment. So like I've been doing a lot of work on how to create denser typologies that are still recognizably houses to like a UK consumer and still provide some of the amenity benefits that you get from a house, but that can deliver those higher densities.
And I think that for me, that kind of goes hand in hand with parking as well, and car parking standards as a design
Yeah,
point. And if you're going for the sort of denser terrace house, are we still going to have a car parking space outside everyone's front door, for example? Because that
Yeah.
massively impacts design, as we know.
I did a presentation recently. We were looking at density, and I did a sort of like triangle of doom. So it's got parking, density, and typology, and you can get yourself into all sorts of messes between those three things, and they need to have a very strong relationship with one another. Because urban designers quite like to put blobs on things and say, oh, this is going to be X number of DPH, but not thinking about what typology that's going to be comprised of and how you fit all the car parking in. So yeah, it's tricky.
And I think, coming back to the previous point around codes or what the design standards are, I gave a talk a few months ago around pattern books, and it's been interesting to see a kind of revival in some discussion around pattern books, I think partly because of Australia and what's happening there. But, I feel that there's a really good case to maybe move beyond the idea of it being a kind of quote unquote code, but actually using some of the work that, people like Vicky, many of our practices are involved with. And actually, I think in the profession, we're working really collaboratively on a lot of this. The teams that we've been involved with certainly are, to produce best practice pattern books that are typology based, where you can say, actually, this is how you do get a house and the parking at X ratio. This is how you get, a range of types, which then can be used much more flexibly to do capacity testing, but also to evolve. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel all the time. We do know that these things are problems. And frankly, the house builders are already using pattern books. So can't government maybe take a bit more of a leap forward to say, here's some best practice around this. These are the sorts of typologies we want to see in the new towns going forward, and save everybody a whole lot of work as well at the same time.
Okay, I think we need to move on.
Yeah.
I suggest we suggest to the person that runs this podcast that there's a whole couple of hours discussion around some of these themes. But let's look forward to what's coming. The things we know are going to happen. I guess one of the big moves is devolution and local government reorganisation and the return of strategic planning. I know, Hannah, you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is obviously a really big one, right? Because I think that the new mayoral authorities, vastly more of them that we're going to be seeing. I live in one that's going to be elected next year. they're going to be wanting to set really bold placemaking visions for their areas around development. I think that's a really good thing. I think it's a massive, massive opportunity. And I think this needs to go hand in hand with things like the New Towns Commission, because actually you need that really unified approach. So, we've already started to see some of that in places like Cambridge, and the kind of revival of the Oxcam arc, or whatever we all want to call it again now, as a thing. I think that's really positive. But looking to the other authority areas, it doesn't take a crystal ball to sort of know which areas are more likely to have some new towns than others. A joined up strategic approach that works at the mayoral authority level as well as at the new locally reorganised government level, and at that kind of New Towns Commission level is what we all want to see, isn't it?
I was involved in the strategic planning group that was organised by Prior and Partners and Katrina Riddell, and it's not officially a government organised body, but we did have really good attendance from Matthew Pennycook and Joanna Aveley at the last session. It's going to feed into some of the thinking around that. And yeah, the joined upness of a national plan for transport and infrastructure, and the New Towns Task Force, where it all needs to work together. And I was very keen for the kind of visioning work to be very specific, because I think we've all read these visions for kind of new places or a strategy for an area, and it just sounds like everywhere else, no matter how hard people tried to make it place specific. And interestingly, there was somebody from more of an investment background there, and she was saying that specificity is a really good way to make these things attractive to investors, because investors need to understand as well what they're getting involved in. I think part of the thinking around the return of strategic planning is that it is going to help to further the growth agenda as well as improve the quality of development that comes forward.
But I think with this comes some risk, right? Because these are also new elected mayors and individuals. And, we need to be really careful, I think, as a profession in terms of how we push the strategic planning and also at central government level, that we're not introducing the risk of rogue electoral forces in parts of the country kind of seizing agendas that maybe are going to be really unhelpful and actually stymieing that. So I think there's this huge opportunity, but I do think we also need to be really politically nuanced, very, very sensitive to what's being said on the ground in local communities, particularly in more marginal and more deprived areas, to make sure that we're not possibly handing a really, really great political football into the wrong hands.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the government has been really good at the national level of taking party politics out of planning. They've grasped the nettle in terms of is it a metal or a nettle? Try to grasp a metal. Don't know, or nettles. Whichever. No, you can't grasp a nettle because that'll hurt your hands, won't it? In terms of, is it? Oh, okay, got it. Okay, we've all learned something. In terms of housing numbers, and so they've grasped the nettle in terms of housing numbers. So they're going for it on housing numbers, but at the same time, they're introducing this strategic planning tier that we've all been crying out for. I think that's not at all controversial amongst the profession again. But by linking that to elected mayors, I'm really worried that there's going to be some pure kind of anti-growth, anti-planning mayors elected, and we might find in the next couple of months the first of those might be in place. So there's a real risk there. Away from that topic, what other new things do we think we might expect in the coming year or two?
It's hard to say. I mean, they're doing so much already. There's been so many policy announcements, so it's hard to know what might come next.
I mean, my favourite one that is my bugbear is the National Development Management Policies, and we've been promised a consultation on them soon. So we're going to be watching that space very clearly, because if got right, again, that's a very powerful tool to speed up planning. Huge opportunity there, and still ensure quality. If a bit weak and wishy-washy, just another layer we don't really need, going to introduce more uncertainty and more kind of ambiguity between national and local planning policy. So yeah, let's hope for some really kind of well-drafted stuff on that one.
Yeah. And if we obviously the principle is if the stuff's being covered at a national level, all the things that are repeated in every single local plan now, local plans really can be specific. Really can get down to those local issues.
Yeah, I was quite pleased that Historic England went on the bonfire of strategy consultees, if we want to coin a phrase. Um, but with the retrofit heritage hat on, I think they've done an awful lot over the last 10 years actually to reduce the amount of applications they consult on, particularly outside of London. I mean, the London, rest of the country difference is another discussion we can maybe have. But outside of London, obviously, they're really just focused on grade 1 and 2 star and significant demolition, much more focused on placemaking, which obviously, what we're discussing today. Um, Interestingly, I have noticed that in some of their more recent publications and announcements, they are now better articulating the value of placemaking. So everybody sort of expects Historic England to talk about how wonderful culture, heritage, architecture is and are. That's kind of, standard. But actually translating that into a broader language of the economic value, the social, mental health benefits, I think is a really interesting nuance and talks more to the government's agenda of growth. So, for instance, they've recently looked at creative businesses and how can flourish in existing buildings and historic settings more. So I think that's really important that that you can change the way that you approach your statutory consultee role, and I think they've demonstrated how to strike quite a good balance.
The other thing we've been promised is a new or a revised National Model Design Code stroke National Design Guide. So that's one to look out for. I think the plan was to amalgamate the two.
Yeah, I think
Does-
that's what I've heard in terms of the direction of travel.
Yeah. So we'll look out for that with interest. Are there any things that we have been disappointed? I think, broadly speaking, I think it's 7 or 8 out of 10 on design for the new government. But there are some things, aren't there, that we would have wanted to have seen that we haven't.
Yeah,
Skills remains an untouched upon
yeah, definitely.
drag.
I mean, that came through in the Tackling Inequality in Housing Design Quality report that UCL launched in February. They have a number of case studies in there of where good design outcomes have been achieved in areas that maybe don't have the same values, same degree of investment. And the consistent factor, so far as I could see in all of the case studies, was the fact that there had been public sector involvement in all of them.
Interesting. Anything else missing or anything else we're waiting for? I know at the last session we talked about kind of design leadership. We shouldn't really compare this government to the Blair government, but the Blair government had John Prescott, which this one doesn't, and had Lord Richard Rogers spearheading the task force, and Sir Michael Lyons on the Newtown task force is a different kind of animal. Of course, he's not a designer, and he would probably learning about design as he goes along. We talked also about kind of local leadership, local champions for design, and so I think that's something we still need to see some progress made on.
Yeah, I think like all of the things that we've discussed, the piecemeal elements are heading in the right direction. I think it would be great to see a more wide-ranging and coherent narrative around like the potential of design to achieve a good standard of growth. They're going for the 1.5 million homes. They're talking about growth. It's, there's a lot of momentum behind that. And I would like design and conversations around design to be seen in the context of that as something that enables growth to happen in a way that benefits people. And, this is a Labour government rather than a Conservative government, so it has, particular ideology and a particular history in terms of the well-being of the population. And I'd really like design to be part of that.
Ultimately, it's about making people's lives better. And I think, we've slightly lost track of the kind of quote unquote 5 missions, I think it was, wasn't it, that were announced at the very beginning of the government, and with a lot of turmoil in other policy areas, we don't hear quite so much about them. But, we said, and I think in the last podcast, what placemaking and development does is it is one place where all of those 5 missions really come together in a really important way. We have that ability and that potential to make places that contribute economically, that contribute to health, that contribute to more social cohesion, all of that at once. So, you know, it's down to us all to keep banging the drum on that as well, isn't it? In all of the forums and the very many meetings and consultations that we all go to.
Yeah, and I was just
Okay.
going to end on a positive note, really, I guess, in the sort of lack of public sector leadership, you know, because of under resourcing. I think I have, as an observation, seen that via sort of the private sector and third sector, that actually through, you know, when you're having public consultation and engagement, you're getting a much more sophisticated, nuanced response as well. I think it's one of those unintended consequences that housing and development has been so much on the agenda, that I find the public is actually much more engaged. And, you know, they're not always going to agree with you, but actually there's a lot more people having the conversation, a lot more passion out there, which I'm finding very invigorating. And actually means that people are coming with a much more baseline understanding, knowledge of the planning system, which is, as we all know, quite complicated if you're not working in it day to day.
The final one for me would be pleased we have our manual for streets, which has been promised again for years and years, and the refresh of that, I think that'll be a key thing. Any other final requests from anybody?
Well, yes, the let's see about the reorganisation of highways authorities as part of local government. Yes, that would be an interesting one. There is an opportunity, if there ever was one, to improve design.
Hello, viewers. Sam again. My thanks to Ben, Katie, Vicky, and Hannah for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning, and local government reorganisation, CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value, infrastructure planning, modernising planning committees, development and nature recovery, grey belt, statutory consultees, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.